I have been tracking military signaling in the Western Pacific for years, and even by the brutal standards of great power rivalry, what unfolded over the South China Sea was extraordinary. A Chinese J-16 did not merely shadow an American aircraft, it sliced directly across the nose of a U.S. Air Force RC-135 and forced that aircraft through wake turbulence in international airspace, a maneuver U.S. Indo-Pacific Command described as unnecessarily aggressive. On May 30th, 2023, that is not routine theater. That is the kind of split-second move that can turn a cold confrontation hot. An intercept by itself was expected. Chinese radio warnings were expected. A close shadow in disputed skies was expected. But what was not supposed to happen was a PLA fighter crossing so close and so abruptly that the cockpit of an American reconnaissance aircraft shook in disturbed air. A moment later, shown on video and reported by Reuters after the Pentagon released its account. In other words, this was not just another tense encounter over contested waters. It was a message delivered at high speed, with steel, fuel, and very little room for error. And once that message was sent, the story did not end there. It widened. Subscribe right now and turn on notifications, because the next phase of this story is even more important than the intercept itself. What unfolded after that close pass revealed a larger pattern involving the South China Sea, the Taiwan Strait, American surveillance missions, Chinese refusal to reopen military communications, and a dangerous campaign of pressure that U.S. officials say has accelerated since 2021. In the next few minutes, this analysis will show exactly what happened in that cockpit, why Beijing chose that moment, and why the next 48 hours after any such encounter are often the most dangerous of all. To understand why this moment mattered, it is necessary to go back more than 2 decades, because the United States and China have been playing this exact game before. On April 1, 2001, according to the Naval History and Heritage Command, a U.S. Navy EP-3 signals intelligence aircraft collided with a Chinese J-82 interceptor roughly 70 miles off Hainan Island. The Chinese pilot was killed. The damaged American plane made an emergency landing on Hainan. All 24 American crew members were detained by the Chinese government for 11 days. That incident burned a permanent lesson into the minds of military planners on both sides. Close intercepts are not symbolic when aircraft are closing at speed. They are mechanical events with strategic consequences. That 2001 collision matters because it established the baseline. Washington continued flying surveillance and reconnaissance missions in international airspace because those flights are legal under its interpretation of international law and because they generate the intelligence necessary for deterrence. Beijing continued objecting because it views close-in American surveillance near its coastline as a threat to its sovereignty and security. Those opposing positions never disappeared. They hardened. Every year, as China built more runways, more radar coverage, more anti-access systems, and a more confident naval air presence in the South China Sea, the physical airspace between political red lines became tighter. The geography also matters. The South China Sea is not just another patch of water. It is a strategic network of air routes, sea lanes, reefs, outposts, radars, and surveillance envelopes. China claims almost all of it, even though several Southeast Asian states hold overlapping claims. And Beijing continues to reject the 2016 Hague arbitration ruling that found its sweeping claims had no basis in international law. That means every American flight through the region is not only a military operation, it is a legal argument with wings. Each transit says one thing, each intercept says another. And because neither side wants to concede precedent, neither side simply stops showing up. Over time, the atmosphere around these encounters changed. What used to be professional shadowing has increasingly become something harder, riskier, and more political. Reuters reported in May 2023 that a senior U.S. defense official said China had declined or ignored more than a dozen requests for talks with the Pentagon since 2021. That detail is extremely important. When aircraft start flying closer while commanders are speaking less, the margin for miscalculation narrows. A calculated rivalry becomes a communications vacuum. A vacuum in military affairs is dangerous because pilots still launch, radars still track, and missions still go forward even when diplomacy freezes. And the behavior was not confined to one isolated encounter. In October 2023, Assistant Secretary of Defense Ely Ratner said the Pentagon had recorded more than 180 coercive and risky Chinese intercepts against U.S. aircraft since the fall of 2021, and nearly 300 when allied and partner aircraft were included. Ratner called it a centralized and concerted campaign to coerce a change in lawful U.S. operational activity. That phrase should not be ignored. A campaign is not an accident. A campaign means repetition, doctrine, intent, and approval somewhere up the chain. It suggests the intercept over the South China Sea was not a spontaneous outburst by one reckless pilot. It may have been part of a larger pattern designed to make American missions feel progressively more expensive and more hazardous. The first chapter of what unfolded is the intercept itself, because if the mechanics are not understood, the stakes are easily missed. On May 26, 2023, according to U.S. Indo-Pacific Command, a PLA J-16 fighter intercepted a USRC-135 over the South China Sea, while the American aircraft was conducting safe and routine operations in international airspace. The Chinese pilot flew directly in front of the RC-135's nose. That detail is the key. A forward cross is more provocative than lateral shadowing because it forces the trailing aircraft into disturbed air created by the lead aircraft's wings and engines. Reuters later reported that video showed the RC-135 cockpit shaking as it passed through that wake turbulence. That kind of turbulence is not just uncomfortable, it is potentially destabilizing, particularly for a large surveillance aircraft carrying sensitive equipment and crew operating at mission altitude. The RC-135 is not a dogfighter. It is a strategic intelligence platform. It is built to collect, process, and relay information, not to jink violently out of the way like a light tactical jet. When a Chinese fighter crosses in front of that aircraft at close range, the Chinese pilot is exploiting the difference between maneuverable interceptor and heavier surveillance platform. It is a coercive move because it communicates dominance without firing a shot. It says, in effect, this airspace may be legally contested on paper, but physically, Beijing is willing to make it costly. According to Reuters, China's embassy in Washington did not comment on the specifics of the maneuver at the time, but accused the United States of frequently deploying aircraft and vessels for close-in reconnaissance that posed a serious danger to China's national security. That response follows a familiar pattern. Beijing reframes the immediate tactical action as defensive and reassigns blame to the existence of the American mission itself. In other words, the dangerous maneuver is not treated as the crisis. The surveillance flight is treated as the crisis. This rhetorical reversal is strategically useful because it allows China to justify increasingly forceful intercepts while claiming restraint. What stands out to me is how calibrated the Chinese move was. This was not a random burst of chaotic aggression. It was a controlled, visible, deniable form of airborne intimidation. The PLA pilot did not open fire. He did not make contact. He executed a pass that sat in the gray zone between routine intercept and near accident. That gray zone is where modern power competition increasingly lives. It is where states test thresholds. It is where one side asks whether the other will flinch, alter routes, reduce tempo, or begin self-deterring. And if Washington adjusts even slightly, Beijing banks the precedent. The second chapter is why Beijing chose this moment and why the timing matters as much as the maneuver. Reuters noted that the May 2023 incident came just before the Shangri-La dialogue in Singapore, after Beijing had already snubbed a request for U.S. Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin to meet his Chinese counterpart. That is not a trivial diplomatic footnote. It means the intercept occurred at a moment when military communications were already constrained and political signaling was intensifying. A close pass under those conditions becomes more than an aerial event. It becomes a substitute for dialogue, a high-speed message sent because quieter channels were not functioning. The Pentagon's broader assessment makes that even clearer. On October 17, 2023, the Defense Department declassified images and videos of risky PLA behavior and said more than 180 incidents had occurred against U.S. aircraft since the fall of 2021. Ratner said that was more in 2 years than in the decade before that. That is a remarkable statistic. When a pattern suddenly exceeds the prior decade, military planners do not call that noise. They call that a shift. And once the pattern is acknowledged as a shift, every intercept has to be read not only for what happened in the moment, but for what it signals about command intent, pilot confidence, and escalation appetite. There is another detail from the Pentagon briefing that should concern anyone watching this closely. Ratner and Admiral John Aquilino both warned that risky intercepts could lead to miscalculation, and Aquilino said he had asked for talks with Chinese counterparts for roughly 2.5 years without success. That creates a dangerous asymmetry. American aircraft continue disciplined, precision operations in international airspace. Chinese fighters continue increasingly forceful challenges. But the mechanisms that might de-escalate a misunderstanding are weak or absent. That is how aviation incidents stop being local. They jump from cockpit to cabinet room. The third chapter is where this expands beyond a single RC-135 and becomes a regional pressure system. In October 2023, Reuters reported that China said it had sent fighter jets to monitor and warn a U.S. Navy P-8A Poseidon that flew through the Taiwan Strait. The U.S. 7th Fleet said the patrol aircraft transited international airspace and that the flight demonstrated America's commitment to a free and open Indo-Pacific. China's Eastern Theater Command dismissed the flight as public hype and said troops remained on high alert. This matters because the platforms and geography changed, but the pattern did not. Whether in the South China Sea or the Taiwan Strait, the operating script is becoming familiar. Lawful U.S. mission, Chinese warning, visible challenge, political messaging. The P-8A is not just another patrol plane. It is one of the West's premier maritime surveillance and anti-submarine platforms, built for persistent awareness over vast stretches of ocean. When China shadows or warns a P-8A in the Taiwan Strait, it is not simply responding to an aircraft. It is contesting the very proposition that the strait is open international airspace. Reuters noted that Taiwan and the United States reject Beijing's claim of jurisdiction over that waterway. So again, the air encounter doubles as a sovereignty dispute. Steel and law are fused together. Every flight is an argument about who writes the rules. Then came another alarming episode. On October 24, 2023, U.S. Indo-Pacific Command said a PLA-J-11 executed an unsafe nighttime intercept of a U.S. Air Force B-52 over the South China Sea. According to the official statement, the Chinese pilot closed with uncontrolled excessive speed, flew below, in front of, and within 10 feet of the bomber, placing both aircraft in danger of collision. 10 feet, at night, around a heavy bomber. That is not professional airmanship. That is a gamble. And when those gambles begin to cluster around different aircraft types and across different sectors, they stop looking like isolated pilot behavior and start looking like a deliberate air power tactic. The B-52 incident is especially revealing because it shows Beijing is not just harassing slow surveillance aircraft. It is willing to test even iconic American combat platforms. That tells me the objective is psychological as much as tactical. A calculated interception of a bomber is meant to project confidence to domestic audiences, test American reaction, and normalize the idea that PLA aircraft can get dangerously close to U.S. assets without paying a price. If that normalization takes hold, the threshold for the next maneuver drops. What seems shocking once becomes manageable the second time, and routine the third. That is how strategic space is eroded. The fourth chapter is that America is not the only target. Allies are getting the same treatment, and that widens the significance of every U.S.-China encounter. Reuters reported on February 13, 2025, that Australia accused a Chinese J-16 of releasing flares within 30 meters of a Royal Australian Air Force P-8A Poseidon in the South China Sea. Canberra called the action unsafe and unprofessional. Beijing replied that the Australian aircraft had deliberately intruded into its airspace and said China's expulsion measures were legitimate, professional, and restrained. Once again, the formula repeated itself almost perfectly. Allied patrol, Chinese challenge, aggressive proximity, reversed blame. Why does that matter for the United States? Because the Pentagon's October 2023 figure rose from 180 incidents against U.S. aircraft to nearly 300 when Allied and partner aircraft were included. That means Beijing's approach is not only about pushing back on Washington, it is about rewriting regional behavior by creating a climate of sustained pressure around the very aircraft that monitor sanctions evasion, track submarines, verify maritime claims, and reassure allies. If Australian, Canadian, Philippine, Japanese, and American crews all start facing the same desperate high-risk tactics, then this is no longer a bilateral irritation. It is an air power campaign against the operating norms of the Indo-Pacific. Current data around Taiwan suggests the pressure ecosystem remains active even when the tempo changes. Reuters reported on March 5, 2026, that China had dispatched 460 military aircraft into Taiwan's air defense identification zone so far that year, even though that represented a drop from the previous year. Reuters also cited Taiwanese officials and analysts who warned that temporary lulls should not be mistaken for a real change in Beijing's intentions, especially because China stages almost daily military activities around Taiwan and may be digesting lessons for larger operations. That is a critical point. A pause does not necessarily mean restraint. Sometimes a pause means recalibration. In military terms, that changes how the intercept of a U.S. aircraft should be read. It is not just a tactical flash. It is one sensor ping inside a much larger readiness picture. China can reduce visible pressure in one area, increase it in another, or cycle between them to preserve ambiguity. One week, the message is delivered by mass air activity around Taiwan. Another week, it is delivered by a fighter crossing the nose of an American aircraft in the South China Sea. Another week, it is delivered by a warning against a P-8A in the Taiwan Strait. The method changes. The strategic purpose remains constant. Test the perimeter, exhaust the response, and normalize Chinese coercion as background weather. The fifth chapter is what this tells us about American strategy and why Washington has been so careful, so precise, and so disciplined in its response. After the May 2023 intercept, U.S. Indo-Pacific Command did not answer with panic or theatrical escalation. It released a measured statement, emphasized international law, and later allowed imagery and video to support the American case. That is a surgical response. It does two things at once. It preserves operational legitimacy by showing the U.S. aircraft was flying lawfully, and it places reputational pressure on Beijing by documenting the unsafe behavior. In other words, Washington's first counterstrike is not kinetic. It is evidentiary. That evidentiary strategy matters because the competition is not just over airspace, it is over narrative control. Beijing wants these encounters framed as defensive responses to foreign provocation. Washington wants them framed as coercive interference with lawful activity. Whoever wins that framing battle shapes Allied perceptions, regional confidence, and the political cost of future operations. This is why declassified footage matters. This is why exact distances matter. This is why the phrase "wake turbulence" matters. Technical specificity is not trivia. It is the ammunition of strategic legitimacy. At the same time, the United States cannot simply stop flying these missions without inviting even greater pressure. If an RC-135 route is quietly adjusted after a dangerous intercept, or if a P-8A transit becomes less frequent after repeated warnings, Beijing will read that not as de-escalation, but as proof that coercion works. That is why official U.S. statements repeatedly say America will continue to fly, sail, and operate wherever international law allows. Those words are not boilerplate. They are deterrence language. They tell allies the United States will not self-deter. They tell Beijing that calculated intimidation will not easily produce strategic retreat. But here is where the situation becomes genuinely dangerous. Deterrence by persistence works only if both sides believe the other can calibrate. If PLA pilots keep pressing closer, flying faster, and crossing more abruptly, then the technical skill of American crews becomes the thin line between successful signaling and catastrophic collision. Ratner said in October 2023 that the skill and professionalism of American service members should not be the only thing standing between PLA fighter pilots and a fatal accident. That is exactly right. A rules-based order cannot depend indefinitely on one side absorbing the risk while the other side tests it. What I find most striking is that Beijing's behavior combines confidence and insecurity at the same time. Confidence, because a state that feels operationally strong is more willing to take visible risks. Insecurity, because a state that feels strategically challenged often resorts to desperate proximity and theatrical coercion to prove control. China is building more capability, but it is also acting like a power that fears the surveillance architecture around it. American aircraft see too much. They map too much. They reassure allies too effectively. From Beijing's perspective, forcing those aircraft to operate under pressure is a way to blind, intimidate, and politically condition the regional environment without crossing into open war. Now all of these threads begin to converge. A J-16 cuts across an RC-135 in the South China Sea. A P-8A is warned in the Taiwan Strait. A J-11 comes within 10 feet of a B-52 at night. Allies face flares and close passes. The Pentagon counts more than 180 risky interactions against U.S. aircraft, and nearly 300 when Allied aircraft are included. Taiwan watchers warn that visible lulls do not mean the pressure campaign is ending. These are not isolated incidents. They feed into each other. Risky intercepts support territorial claims. Territorial claims justify more warnings. More warnings normalize more dangerous maneuvers. And every successful maneuver encourages the next one. That is why the real crisis is not one interception. It is the compound effect of repeated, coercive contact in crowded, contested, high-value air corridors. One crisis sits in the cockpit, where a pilot has seconds to judge closure rate and turbulence. Another sits in the command chain, where officials decide whether to release footage, protest diplomatically, or alter mission patterns. A third sits at the alliance level, where regional governments ask whether the United States can continue precise, professional presence operations without eventually being trapped into either backing down or overreacting. Put those three together, and the danger multiplies. The countdown mechanism in a situation like this is brutally simple. The first 48 hours after a close intercept are the tactical danger window, because that is when both militaries assess radar tracks, review cockpit video, reconstruct geometry, and decide whether to answer with a more visible patrol or a more aggressive challenge. Then comes the next 10 to 15 days, which is the strategic signal window. That is when analysts watch for repeat behavior, new transits through the Taiwan Strait, bomber flights over the South China Sea, Allied patrol activity, or additional public statements from theater commands. If Beijing repeats the same tactic inside that window, the message is intentional. If Washington responds with another lawful mission, the counter message is equally clear. And there is one more reason that countdown matters. Reuters reported in 2026 that Chinese military flights around Taiwan had temporarily fallen, but Taiwanese officials warned against assuming any real change in Beijing's intentions and said larger operations could still follow. In other words, pauses can be deceptive. A quieter radar picture today can conceal a more dangerous operation tomorrow. That is why any intercept of a U.S. aircraft must be read not only for what happened in that minute, but for what follows in the days after. The close pass is the spark. The real question is whether the system around it is stabilizing or hardening. So here is the bottom line. China's warplane intercepted a U.S. aircraft, but what unfolded was much bigger than a single dangerous maneuver. It exposed a broader, coordinated pattern of risky PLA behavior from the South China Sea to the Taiwan Strait. It showed how quickly a lawful American mission can be turned into a coercive airborne confrontation. It revealed how thin the safety margin becomes when communication channels are weak, political stakes are high, and one side increasingly relies on intimidation in the gray zone. And it proved that the contest is no longer just about territory. It is about whether open international airspace remains open when challenged by a determined major power. Subscribe right now and turn on notifications, because this story is not slowing down, and the next update may come faster than most people expect. The pattern is ongoing, the air corridors remain crowded, and every new intercept tells us something about Beijing's threshold, Washington's resolve, and the stability of the Indo-Pacific. Leave a comment below and answer this directly. Does Beijing keep pushing these dangerous intercepts until it forces a change in U.S. operations? Or does Washington answer with even more visible, disciplined patrols to prove the pressure is failing? Every comment is read. Stay informed, stay ahead, and the next brief will be even more important.